Thank you for inviting me to participate. I think that my views are quite different than the last speaker. I think that from a counter-cyclical perspective, I think one of the good things about the Ravitch report is that it recognizes that under GAAP we will need to have even greater reserves, in effect rainy day funds. And I think one of the problems is GAAP could easily be interpreted to mean you couldn't use reserves. So I think, let me just read what the Ravitch report says on this. Experts on state finance generally recommend reserves in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% of revenues. Moreover, as the state moves to budgeting on the basis of GAAP as applied to governments, reserves will become even more important. Under GAAP, the state will need to set aside resources that are adequate to ensure against volatility in these reimbursements and payments. Now, it would make no sense to set aside reserves of 10 to 15%. You know, in the Ravitch plan, it's not suggesting just of the general fund, but of all state operations funds. There would be no logic to setting aside the money if you couldn't use it. So I think that the clear intent, and it is correct, is that the version of budgeting on a GAAP basis that's used clearly allows for the use of reserves. Now the challenge is to say what will be the criteria, and the Ravitch report leaves that to be determined. It says the state will have to determine the appropriate size of its reserves and the rules for their use and replenishment. And I think the biggest challenge, if you're trying to be rigorous about creating out-year structural deficits, is what are the rules? What will trigger the occasion when you can use rainy day funds? I mean, it's sort of like obscenity. We know it when we see it, but can we write a rule? And I don't think that for the rainy day fund, the state's second rainy day fund, which was created by Governor Spitzer's recommendation in early 2007, I don't think it does a better job of coming up with a trigger mechanism than the existing rainy day fund, which is for the long existing rainy day fund, which was for unplanned end of year deficits. I think the Ravitch plan's greatest concern is structurally unbalanced budgets. It's concerned about the out years. The out years don't vary much on cash and GAAP. Whether they're done on a cash basis or a GAAP basis, if they're done halfway honestly, they're going to show what they show. And they show large, what you could call a structural gap. You have to distinguish between how much of our current gaps, because we're in this unprecedented recession, how much is structural and how much is cyclical. But assuming you do that, I don't think there's a real difference on the out years between cash and GAAP. I think the real controlling force of GAAP is the current year budget, of not just adopting a GAAP budget, but ending the year in GAAP balance. I think that is the rigorous recommendation being made here, is GAAP balance for the current year. I don't think there's a real difference in the out years. I think to deal with the out years, the solution isn't a multi-year plan or a control board, and I would agree with part of what EJ said on this, that I think that given that a governor can simply not agree to a plan and have trigger in very quickly under the Ravitch plan the ability to do pro rata cuts, a governor who wanted to do pro rata cuts could just not agree in the 15-day period, and it's a slightly longer period in the assembly version of this bill. I think the real change that needs to be made, if the concern is as stated with the out-year structural gaps, is to adopt some version of a pay-go requirement, similar to what the Congress used effectively in the 1990s when we did move to a surplus in good times. It's a sort of a tangent, but ideally what President Clinton and Treasury Secretary Rubin accomplished was quite important and incredible, of having a surplus in good times, which meant you could practice fiscal policy better and have deficits in bad times. It's that President Bush, when he came into office, changed the justification for his tax cut. He had the same tax cut proposal in the campaign as when he took office, but there were different justifications. during the campaign it was, we've got this terrible surplus, we've got to give it back to the people. We need income tax cuts. But then when he was elected, and the recession was clearly on, he said, well, now we need the same tax cuts I proposed in the campaign for a different reason. We needed to stimulate the economy. But even though we needed to stimulate the economy, we're not going to do it on a temporary basis, as you would for a counter-cyclical measure. We're going to do it on a permanent basis. And so they reestablished a structural deficit at the federal level. The pay-go requirement went by the boards after the Clinton administration. It's now back, but it's back in a really terrible economic time. And the Congress is now struggling to do what's necessary for the country because of the pay-go requirement. The Republican presidency of George Bush and the Republican Congresses did not have a pay-go requirement, but the Democratic Congress has voluntarily imposed on itself a pay-go requirement, and it's imposed on itself at a time when the country is in more dire economic circumstances than it's been probably since the Depression. And so it's creating a real bind, and I think that leads to one of the things that Liz Krueger said in her remarks, that there does have to be some escape clause for really bad times. In terms of the enforcement mechanism, just to summarize what I said, I think an enforcement mechanism that in effect allows any of the parties, the governor or any of the legislative leaders, to force the default mechanism by not agreeing with a reasonable period of time should not be accepted. The requirement should be on the legislature and the governor to do this. I think that having a review panel issue quarterly reports on the state's financial situation is fine, but the power of its opinions and advice should be their bully pulpit, not a requirement in bond covenants that concede unilateral impoundment authority to the governor. I think that having a requirement for gap-balanced budget is okay, as long as it is explicitly provided that rainy day funds and other reserves can be used in bad times. Otherwise, a requirement for gap balance would require that recurring revenues exceed recurring expenditures in bad years as well as good years. And as I said earlier, that would render irrelevant the 10 to 15% reserve fund requirement. The report praises the division of the budget's multi-year forecasts. There is too much inconsistency from year to year in the format and assumptions underlying those forecasts. They are not consistent. There needs to be a uniform set of expenditure codes and financial plan formats used consistently in the governor's budgets and the controller's financial reports. Just taking one of the items that the Ravitch report places reliance on is, in effect, suggesting that the requirement for a balanced budget be on all state funds, not just the general fund. They be on state operating funds. Well, the controller's reports on state funds do not match the budget division's reports or budgets on state funds, because you have the governor's projections for current years, and so I say, okay, if I want to put a historical series together, I can take what the budget division has for this year and its projected years and put it together with the controller's data for the past years. But the controller and the governor, or the controller and the budget division, disagree about how a significant part of federal funds is counted, whether it's counted as federal funds or state funds. That's the reimbursement we get from Medicaid for the Office of Mental Health and Office of Mental Retardation. The controller's office insists, for what they say are good accounting reasons, and they might be right, that it's state funds when it's spent. The budget division says it's really federal money, so it's federal funds. So on this key measure that the Ravitch report is suggesting we rely on, that we balance the budget on state operating funds, we don't even have a historical series that is consistent between the governor and the controller. When you try to match up the governor's projected cash flow formats with the monthly reports from the controller, you can't match them up because they have slight unnecessary differences in the way they treat transfers to and from other funds and the way they aggregate the information. So we're a long way from having the infrastructure we need to put this into bond covenants. I think that goes much further beyond putting the cart before the horse. There also needs to be a source, in addition to the governor's budget division, for multi-year forecasts. At the federal level, the CBO is as capable as the OMB in doing multi-year forecasts. In New York City, the New York City Financial Control Board, the New York City Controller, and the New York State Controller all have the ability to do reasonably accurate multi-year forecasts. It will take other parties at the state level some time to develop that capability. This leads me to think that there should be a year or two of practice with the review board and the effort at gap budgeting, a review board without impoundment forcing authority. The effort at gap budgeting before the state is sure that the approach is solid enough to embed in bond covenants or in permanent statute. On a factual matter, I think the report is incorrect in saying that only 5 to 5.5 billion of New York State's current budget gap is attributable to recession-related revenue decreases and expenditure increases. To take one example, just 2 years ago, in January of 2008, the Budget Division, same forecasters as there are now, January 2008, the Budget Division's forecast of personal income tax revenues for 2010-11 was 44-point-something billion. Currently, in January of 2010, 2 years later, in that executive budget, the forecast for personal income tax revenues was 37 billion, down 7 billion, but that was only because in the coming year, they're counting on $5.5 billion from the high-end income tax increases enacted last year. If it wasn't for that, the difference between the January 2008 financial plan and the January 2010 financial plan would be a difference of over $12 billion in personal income tax receipts. The difference between 44-point-something billion and 31.7 billion. I think that is not a structural deficit. That is the result of the incredible cyclical downturn where states throughout the country have seen revenue fall off the table. So I think there has to be a real effort at disentangling what the structural deficit is and what the cyclical deficit is. The last thing I'd mention is kind of technical. I think it's a mistake to go from the general fund for balance requirement to all state operating funds. I think what we need is a more legitimate definition of the general fund, where things that should be in the general fund are. But there are kinds of dedicated funds which clearly should not be in the general fund and shouldn't be balanced on an annual basis, and putting them into the state operating funds for balance purposes will create noise and unintended consequences. Let me just go through a specific example. Let's say the state had an oil spill fund into which oil companies and people with oil storage tanks paid fees that are accumulated and periodically spent when there is a need for an oil spill cleanup. If there is a unified balanced budget requirement that covers both the general fund and all non-general state funds, one would count the revenues from the industry fees when they come in, i.e. when they're earned. But the large expenditure that would need to be made when a spill occurred would exceed revenues received in that 1 year, even though the expenditure didn't exceed the amounts accumulated in the fund. And this would cause the budget to fall out of balance. So I think it's too simple and too far to say the balanced budget requirement should apply to all funds. When it comes to borrowing, I could be wrong about this. The people on the inside of the government know better, the Budget Division and the Fiscal Committee staffs. But I do not think that our budget this year needs to be balanced through budgeting for operating expenses. I agree with something that Liz Kruger said in her comments. Denny Farrell had said, Wall Street is not going to revert to the good old days for a couple of years. Well, in 2008 calendar year, Wall Street firms had losses of about $43 billion. In 2009, as reported by the New York Stock Exchange, its member firms had net profits of over $61 billion. That included about 2/3 of the firms with profits of about $64 billion, and about 1/3 with losses adding up to a couple billion. So Wall Street has turned the corner. I think Liz is correct when she says the general public cannot stand more taxes and fees, but I think she's also right when she says Wall Street has recovered and it has the ability to help. So I think before we borrow for operating purposes, I think that as she suggested, Wall Street should come to the table and make some contribution, because under our current tax system, because of the fact that a lot of the bonuses were paid in stock options, and because those net operating losses from 2008 cancel out a lot of the profits from 2009, the contribution that Wall Street is making is not proportionate to its level of profitability. I think that rather than taxing, say, all businesses with a gross receipts tax, or taxing all people with a value-added tax or anything, I think that on an ability to pay basis, that Wall Street can contribute more than it is contributing right now based on its current profits. And so I think, for example, the governor of Colorado at the end of February signed a 3-year suspension of taking operating losses in excess of $250,000. That's one method for dealing with this. We have also suggested other methods, including a temporary, even if it's only 6 months or a year, reduction in the stock transfer tax rebate from 100% to 80%. I think we need a contribution now from Wall Street. Thank you.